Welcome back to PSY 222, Research Methods in the Psychological Sciences. This will be part 2 of Chapter 2, and what we'll be going over is the different types of research questions that we typically ask in psychological science. So regardless of whether you're a researcher in psychology or some other scientific endeavor, there are 4 basic goals that define the questions that we ask as researchers. The first category of question that we can ask, and these also become categories of methodologies, of types of methods or types of tools that we can use. So the first goal of science is to describe phenomena as they exist. Often these are just descriptive questions like how many or how often, but they may take other forms as well. The second broad goal is being able to predict when phenomena are most likely to occur or when they're not. These are often called associative or correlational questions, and they are often phrased as how does variable 1 predict variable 2, how does variable 2 predict variable 1, or how does some combination of a set of variables predict a specific outcome. The third broad goal is explaining phenomenon, and this is where we get into causal explanations for outcomes. And typically what you're referring to in methodology terms is using experiments to determine cause and effect relationships. Finally, we routinely have the goal, especially in psychological sciences, of taking the findings of research looking at descriptive questions, predictive questions, and explanatory questions, and applying them in the real world to solve real world problems. So those are our 4 goals: description, prediction, explanation, and application. Now, I took a screenshot of this table in your text, and I just wanted to draw your attention to it because it does a nice job of giving you a description of each of these types of questions or goals of psychological research, with description really focusing on defining, classifying, listing, categorizing events, prediction involving identifying and describing correlations among variables or associations among variables, explanation involving researchers wanting to understand the causes of various phenomena that they're interested in, and then application involving applying research findings to real-world problems or situations. And then your authors give you some specific examples of each of those. Now we're going to go through each one specifically and think about what they mean in terms of questions that we might ask as researchers. So as the table identified, description involves defining, classifying, cataloging, categorizing events, and in some ways, in some cases, these descriptive questions that we ask will identify certain relationships among variables, but mostly in terms of co-occurrence. One of the terms that your authors describe that is connected to this descriptive goal is the idea of nomothetic, where is the comparison between nomothetic and idiographic description. So most psychology research is that nomothetic variety, where we're trying to eventually describe some general laws or general rules that help us to get our heads around, in general, what are human beings like, in general, what are animals like, in terms of their psychological functioning. So that's the nomothetic approach. Idiographic approaches are individual. Now, descriptive questions can come in either form, either nomothetic, where you're attempting to describe the broad and apply it to general theories or general scientific laws, or idiographic. The methods that your authors describe are mostly of the idiographic type when they're talking about descriptive hypotheses, but do recognize they can come in either form. There's also, your authors draw your attention to the distinction between quantitative findings and qualitative findings. When we describe phenomenon, we can describe them in terms of numbers, how many, how often, and we can also describe them in terms of their qualities. Like, what are the definitions or the classifications? How do those categories within those broad descriptions, how do they differ? A simple example of a qualitative variable would be, looking at college students in terms of how many years they've been in school. So first year students versus second year students versus third year students, and so on. A quantitative variable would be, for example, incoming students can report their ACT or SAT scores. Those are numbers, and I could describe what their values were. If you go back to part 1 of this lecture, when I talked about cooperative behaviors in children, if an observer is counting the number of cooperative actions taken by kids in free play, that's a quantitative. You're counting how many. When we're talking about predictive questions, we're largely talking about how variables that we're interested in predict one another. If you think, here's a simple example. The reason why colleges and universities ask you for your transcripts and your GPA and your ACT or SAT scores is because in research it's been shown that those numbers, those metrics, are useful, not perfectly useful, but they're useful in predicting how successful you will be your first year in college. Their usefulness as a predictor is not as strong in the later years of college, but it's a fairly good predictor of your success in your first year. So there we're talking about predictions. How well do these numbers, like your high school GPA or your ACT and SAT scores, how well do those predict your performance academically as a college student in your first year? And they predict reasonably well. If you're trying to predict second year performance, third year performance, or ultimate graduation performance, your college GPA is a better predictor. So see, just working through that example, you're trying to look at variables and see how do they predict other variables. Another concrete example, if I give people a measure of, let's say, self-esteem, and high scores reflect high levels of self-esteem, I could use that to predict people's level of academic confidence. And there are measures of that, and typically what's found is that the higher people's scores on self-esteem, they're higher their scores in academic confidence, meaning that when people generally have high self-esteem, they also tend to have confidence in their abilities academically. What we're really talking about here when we're asking prediction questions is correlations. So we're looking at relationships among variables. And that allows us to describe. So if you're doing prediction, if you're asking a predictive question, you have to describe the variables that you're interested in, but then you do a statistical analysis to determine how strongly related they are and in what direction. So with each of these types of questions, we start with description, and then we can add to what we know descriptively by asking predictive questions. When scores, and this should be reviewed for you, you've learned probably in your intro class, and also other 200 level classes you may have taken in psychology. We usually have a methods chapter at the beginning of those classes. Anytime you have scores on one variable, and these are quantitative variables in some cases, you want to be able to use those scores to predict values on a second variable. And what we say is we describe that in terms of those variables being correlated with one another. If you find statistically that there is a correlation between measures, then what we can use that to do is to describe the association to enable us to make predictions more broadly. So for example, if I know there's a connection between self-esteem and academic confidence, then I can ask more questions. What other variables may interact with those? What other variables may they be associated with? To give me a picture on how these variables might be woven together, to give me a fuller explanation of some broader set of experiences. Now, predictive questions don't take the leap that will come next into explaining why there's a relationship. And in fact, they don't even give you the information that you would need to say that one of these variables is driving changes in the other. They don't give you the ability to talk about the direction of that causal pathway. In order to do that, we have to ask explanatory questions. And in this case, we're going to move beyond simply describing individual phenomenon. We're going to move beyond describing predictive relationships among variables to actually determining cause and effect. And your authors talk about how there are 3 conditions that have to be met for you to draw a causal conclusion about the nature of a connection between variables. First, you do have to demonstrate that there is a correlation or a covariation of those variables. But you also have to take the next step of saying A causes changes in B, not the reverse. You need to be able to demonstrate, then that's what your authors mean by a time order relationship, or I've also heard it called a temporal sequence. So you have to be able to show that not only are A and B correlated as variables, but also a change in A causes, it comes before a change in B, but not the reverse. You know, changing the level of B doesn't have any impact on the level of A. And then beyond that, you have to show that there aren't other variables that are involved. You have to eliminate other potential causes, and your authors call those confounds or confoundings or confounding variables. Now, the experimental method is pretty much the only way we can go about achieving the explanatory goal, because the experimental method allows us to isolate the potential causal variable of interest, manipulate it systematically, eliminate confounding variables, and establish that time order sequence so that we can determine the nature of the relationship between the variables that goes beyond simple prediction and description. Finding out and really thinking about plausible other alternative explanations is often challenging. I have lots of conversations with my seniors in senior research when it gets to the point where I want them to write about their findings in their discussion sections of their research reports. They often really struggle with coming up with possible explanations for their findings that go beyond what they hypothesized. And it's more than just an intellectual exercise. It's a very important aspect of the scientific method. It's kind of like, imagine you're a detective and you've got really good evidence against one perpetrator of a given crime. If you're doing detective work like a scientist, you're going to look at not just the evidence you have about your target, the person you've already identified as the perpetrator. You're also going to look for intentionally disconfirming evidence. So you're going to look for evidence that other people might be the criminal. Science is kind of the same way. So when we are looking for plausible other alternative causes for relationships that we might find between variables, that's exactly what we're doing. We're looking for disconfirming evidence, or we're looking for other variables that may be involved in this causal pathway. Sometimes we call those intervening variables, or third variables, and then further research would have to be done in order to tease apart what are the effects of these other possible causal variables, and that will lead you down a pathway of trying to kind of look at complex causal models for behaviors. Human behaviors that are really complicated, and most of human behavior is really complicated, but think about aggressive behavior or prosocial behavior or prejudice. Those are complex social behaviors. They're complex human behaviors. That means there's going to be a system of variables, a whole constellation of them that interact in complicated ways. So our job as researchers who are looking to find explanations is to do the heavy lifting of multiple experiments, and probably using a mixture of descriptive, predictive, and experimental methods in order to tease apart those relationships. Your authors talk about this idea of research being confounded, and one of the key challenges in doing good experimental research is exerting experimental control. And when we're doing good control, that means we're isolating fully the potential impact of our independent variables. When research is confounded, as your authors put it, it's impossible for you to really confidently say that your independent variable is the thing that caused a change in the dependent variable. This can be anything as simple as, you didn't pay attention to scheduling your data collection sessions, and it turns out that all of the participants in one experimental group who were handled by a particular researcher got a piece of information, accidentally or otherwise, that they shouldn't have had. And that becomes a confound because none of the other groups had that same information. Any difference you find may be tainted by that fact. So that's what your authors mean by a confound that can interfere with your ability to interpret your experimental findings. Finally, your researchers, ultimately we want to generalize these findings more broadly to different populations and settings. So one of the confounds that we often forget to think hard about is that a lot of our research is relying on college student populations as our subjects or as our participants. So good experimental work will be replicated with more than one populations that are more diverse, and replicated in different locations. I think about the classic example of research on prosocial behavior, where the original research was done in tightly controlled laboratory settings where an emergency, such as fake smoke being pumped under a doorway to create the illusion of an emergency, or having an actor carefully stage a fake seizure in a carefully controlled laboratory setting where the only independent variable being controlled was, or being manipulated rather, was how many people observed the emergency. Now, what they did after that was they staged emergencies in all kinds of real life situations, and they manipulated different kinds of emergencies. So you had someone, an actor, pretending to have a heart attack in a subway or in a mall or on the street. Sometimes the actor was dressed in nice business attire. Sometimes the actor was dressed like a street person. Sometimes the actor was doused in alcohol, so they looked not only like a street person, but like a drunk street person. Or they were doused in alcohol while wearing a business suit. Sometimes the actors were female, sometimes they were male. Sometimes the emergencies were not medical emergencies. You just had a person carrying a bunch of things and they accidentally dropped them. Or you have a situation where someone appears to need to mail a letter and they drop the letter and they're somewhere in the vicinity of a mailbox, and you see whether people pick up the mail and they deliver it to the mailbox. So what these researchers did was they created all different kinds of populations, different settings, different conditions, so that they could get a more complete explanation of what's called the bystander effect and when it would be impactful on people's prosocial behavior. Now, our last type of question is an application question, or a last type of goal. For many of us as psychologists, we would like to see even our laboratory-based experiments be applied in the real world to address real-world problems. For many of you, you're interested in psychology or neuroscience or human development because you want to move into some form of helping profession. When we do our helping work, when we are clinicians, counselors, health psychologists, rehab specialists, whatever we're doing, the techniques that we use, the tools that we use, should be informed by research, should be informed by science. In applied research, we're taking our skills as researchers and then testing out those ideas, those theories, those hypotheses. We're putting them in a real-life context. Some applied research is program evaluation. Some applied research is actually testing a particular tool or technique or curriculum, if you're talking educational research, in the real world setting to see if it works. Now, this kind of points out for us the difference between applied research and basic research. Basic research is done for its own sake. We want to ask questions and answer questions because we're curious, and we want to advance theory. Or test very specific hypotheses related to theories. In applied research, we're often extending and then taking that basic research information and putting it to the test in the real world to see if it functions. An example from medical science, let's say that you want to know the impact of a particular medication on symptoms of anxiety. Frequently, drug tests start in animal models, so testing safety, testing how the organism functions when exposed to the medication. Ultimately, you want to apply that and give it to people suffering from symptoms of anxiety to see whether or not the medication is effective. Now, there's a whole lot of steps in between that animal model and the human model. But that's a real objective way of talking about these distinctions. A more psychological example, learning theory. There are lots of theories in learning and cognition that talk about how do people learn, how do they store information, and those theories, those hypotheses associated with those theories can be tested in the laboratory in a basic research kind of way. Now you can take what you learn about learning and memory and then apply it to the classroom. That's applied research. So let's say that you're a reading teacher, a reading specialist, and you've looked at the research literature on how reading is learned, and that's the basic research. Then you design a curriculum based on that research, and you want to test to see if your newly designed curriculum is actually effective in improving reading scores. So you would apply the technique, design a program test, deploy it, and then look at the data to see if your curriculum was effective. Now, to pull some of these threads together, what science, and it doesn't matter if you're talking psychological science or science in other domains, we do, not always, but we frequently are engaged in this process communally of theory construction and then testing elements of theories. And this is the real social nature of science. Sometimes you have just one person, and this one scientist has created a theory, and it's that person's theory, and they test it and they publish on it, and no one else is involved. But that's a relative rarity. That doesn't happen very often. Usually theory evolves among a community of scholars, and the theory is tested, and little pieces of the theory are tested, and there's a back and forth in the research literature as the theory continues to evolve. Simple example, there used to be a theory called frustration aggression, the frustration aggression hypothesis, and it was connected to a broader theory. The original hypothesis said that when organisms are frustrated, they will respond with aggression. Now, in some animal species, that might actually be the case. You frustrate a particularly raucous species, and you may always get bit. I don't know. But originally, the theory, the hypothesis was frustration was a required kind of antecedent to aggressive behavior. Well, testing among a variety of scholars showed that humans, being annoyingly complex as they are, didn't always respond to frustration with aggression. Sometimes frustrated people just sort of sigh and move on. Sometimes frustrated people displace that frustration and act out in ways that are non-aggressive. Sometimes they lash out and are aggressive. So the researchers had to say, so what makes the difference? There has to be another variable in there called an intervening variable. And what they found was that in terms of applying the hypothesis, aggression is a state of readiness that makes aggression possible. In between, anger is required. So typically, just to give you the short version of how this theory evolved, frustration is a readiness state. If people are frustrated and angry, and they have a target that they can actually hurt, then frustration will lead to aggression. So you can kind of see how the theory, it starts in one place, but then science and the community of scholars, they weigh in. So theories are proposed, explanations for causes are proposed, they're tested, they're evaluated, and there's conversation, largely through the research literature, whether it's in journals or in conferences or in labs made up of lots of different people. So theories, if you remind yourself what is a theory, it's a logical set of propositions, a logical set of statements that helps to organize our understanding of a particular kind of phenomenon. One of my favorite theories in social psychology is attribution theory. So attribution theory helps us to understand how do human beings explain in a causal way why other people do what they do. Like, why did that person do that? You ask yourself those questions all the time. Social psychologists explain how you answer that question using attribution theory. So it's a set of organized propositions that helps to explain a group of events. Intervening variables, as I've said before, those are concepts like in frustration aggression, the frustration aggression hypothesis. One of the intervening variables is the presence or absence of anger. And that helps us to know when is it that when you are frustrated, when will you be more likely to behave aggressively? And it turns out that anger is an intervening variable. But so is your perception of the risk of retaliating against someone who has made you angry. So that's another intervening variable that we have to discover on the way to testing our theories and continuing to evolve those theories. Good theories, successful theories, they tend to organize what we know, pulling information. Students often say, why do I have to review the literature? Why can't I just do my experiment? And it's because you need to look at what has come before you so that you understand what are some of these intervening variables. What are some of the ways in which these variables have already been operationalized? That's what helps you to design the stronger study, the more effective piece of research for testing hypotheses that actually need to be tested. I'll probably say this way too many times across the semester, but I had another common conversation I have with my seniors in senior research. They come up with an idea and they're really excited about it, and I have to be, the wet blanket and say, no, you can't go there. It's done. It's been tested. It's been tested 1,000 times. We're not going there again. And then there's sadness and disappointment and stuff. So when we look at that empirical knowledge, when we look at the collective wisdom of researchers in a given area, it can help us to actually choose questions and choose rigorous methods for testing those questions that can actually advance our theories. How do we evaluate theories? There are lots of rubrics for this, for thinking about how to tell a great theory from a mediocre theory from a crappy theory. We try to look at the internal consistency, the logic of the theory. If theories are just filled with circular reasoning, then they tend to be dismissed as not being scientific. If they're tightly constructed, they have testable phenomena or constructs, then they tend to be seen as more rigorous. We take note of whether theories make predictions or lead to hypotheses that are clearly measurable and that make sense to us, and that's what we mean by parsimonious. That's one of my favorite all-time words. Parsimonious explanations are like the simplest explanation, the more straightforward explanation. Theories that are excessively complex, that kind of tangle you up in details of unmeasurable variables, are seen as not good theories. They're not testable, they're excessively complex, and they tend not to be useful for explaining real-life phenomenon. So that concludes part 2 of chapter 2. I'll see you again for part 3, or not part 3, chapter 3.